Hello friends, my name is JJ, and today I thought we would talk about Canadian paper money. I don't know how I've been making videos about Canadian things for nearly a decade and never gotten around to this topic until now, but here we are. Although I will admit that one of the reasons I'm making this video now is because I low-key think I broke some news about the future of Canadian money the other day, which we will talk about in a bit. So the design of paper money is clearly a great window into the specific things and people that a country cares about, unless you live in Europe, and Canada is no exception. Canadian paper money has a pretty long and stable tradition of being used as a platform to illustrate and emphasize various component parts of the Canadian cultural canon, including nature, history, politics, and even economics. The design of Canadian money is also noteworthy for just how stable and consistent it has been over the decades, with the government only very recently showing any interest in shaking things up. All right, so let's go back to the start. Well, maybe not the start. Let's say 1935. I don't want to get into the entire centuries-long history of paper money in Canada, in part because a lot of it involves explaining the history of colonial banking in British North America, which is a subject, I must confess, I still do not totally understand, despite my best efforts. Suffice it to say, by late 19th century Canada, paper money was basically understood as a certificate of a loan, with both the Canadian government and private banks issuing loan certificates of this sort. Canadians generally preferred getting money from their banks, which were seen as more reliable guarantors than the incompetent and indebted Canadian colonial government. All of Canada's major banking chains accordingly printed and distributed their own paper money, usually featuring portraits of the bank's executives, which is kind of funny. And then various things happened in the early 20th century, and in 1935, this mixed system was brought to a close. The Canadian government created the Bank of Canada, and it gradually established a monopoly on the making of paper currency in Canada, though paper money from private banks was still being used as recently as 1950. So that's why I'm going to begin my story of Canadian paper money in 1935. It represented the hard reset of the Canadian currency system and the start of a new cultural tradition in Canada that has continued uninterrupted to this day. So, the first ever Bank of Canada bills came in a staggering 10 different denominations: $1, $2, $5, $10, $20, $25, which was weird, $50, $100, $500, and a staggering $1,000 bill. $1,000 is a lot of money now, but according to the Bank of Canada's own inflation calculator, back in 1935, 1,000 Canadian dollars would be the equivalent to over 22 grand today. I'm not really sure who would have a need to be hauling around that much cash, but it was an option. So the 1935 bill series introduced a couple of conventions to Canadian currency that modern-day Canadians now take for granted, including a system of color-coding the different denominations and a basic design tradition where there is a portrait of a person on the front and a picture of something of Canadian cultural relevance on the back. In this case, the cultural things were a series of pseudo-classical illustrations depicting the various abstract wonders of the Canadian economy, including innovation, commerce, communication, transportation, electricity, and a couple symbolizing agriculture. On the reverse side, every bill except for two featured a portrait of someone from the British royal family, which in those days meant the wife, children, and grandchildren of King George V. Fun fact, this resulted in the future Queen Elizabeth II's first ever appearance on a banknote of any country, anywhere. She was on the Canadian 20 in her capacity as one of the King's young granddaughters. Putting so many British royals on Canadian money was a bit gratuitous, even back then, given that Canada had secured almost complete independence from the British Empire just a couple of years earlier. But the Canadian political elite of the 1930s was still very keen to encourage pro-British sentiment among the Canadian public, not the least of which was because Europe was, of course, on the brink of another world war in which Canadians would eventually be rallied to fight for the British side. Now, the two highest denomination bills, the 500 and the preposterous 1000, did not feature Brits, but rather two former Canadian Prime Ministers, Sir John A. Macdonald and Sir Wilfrid Laurier. Macdonald and Laurier were the two guys who basically ran Canada for all of the Victorian period, from the late 1850s to 1911, and they were both objectively very great men in the historic sense, in that Canada's turn-of-the-century emergence as one of the world's wealthiest industrialized democracies can in large part be attributed to the policies that they pursued. As two national symbols, they are also nicely symmetrical, given one was from the Conservative Party and one was a Liberal, one was an English Canadian, one was French, one was from Ontario, one was from Quebec, one was Catholic, and one was Protestant, and these were all of the major points of cultural polarization in the Canada of that time. Just 2 years later, in 1937, the Bank of Canada put out a new line of bills that simplified things a bit. The $25 and $500 bills were turfed, as were the portraits of all of the various princes and princesses. Instead, a portrait of the new king, George VI, was put on every bill, except for the 1000, which still had Laurier, and the 100, which now got Macdonald since there was no more 500. The allegorical images on the back remained the same. The 1937 line also marked the introduction of the specific color coding system that Canadian currency still uses to this day. The 1 was green, the 2 was brown, the 5 was blue, the 10 was purple, the 20 was green, the 100 was brown, and the 1000 was pink. The only exception was the 50, which was orange but is now red. It is also interesting to note that these bills marked the first time that the Government of Canada created something that was bilingual, as they had both English and French text. The government had previously experimented with making French language bills for use in the French-speaking province of Quebec, but this was expensive and inconvenient, so in 1937 they started just putting both languages on all bills. The third line of Canadian paper money was released in 1954. Once again, the monarch had to be updated since Queen Elizabeth had now ascended to the throne, and I guess Queen Elizabeth mania was so intense that they booted Macdonald and Laurier off the 100 and 1000, so it was all Lizzie all the time. The allegoric illustrations depicting the glories of Canadian modernity were likewise ditched in favor of 7 bucolic depictions of the diverse Canadian landscape. The fun trivia fact about these bills is that some people became convinced that they could see the face of Satan in the young queen's hair, and this became a whole bizarre moral panic in 1950s Canada, and the Bank of Canada eventually had to reprint the bills to appease the frightened public. And now, so-called devil's hair bills from the 1950s are these precious collector's things. In 1969, the Bank of Canada released their fourth line of bills, but through a unique system. Previously, all of the new denominations would be released all at once, but ever since 1969, the Bank of Canada would gradually introduce each new version of a denomination bill into circulation one at a time, usually one per year. I'm not super sure what the advantage of this system is versus just having them all come out at once. I assume it has something to do with security. I feel it's always about security when it comes to money. The backs of the 69 era bills are kind of an interesting synthesis of the bills of the 50s and 30s. They mostly depicted scenes of Canada's economic prosperity, but in realistic Canadian environmental contexts. So like fishermen in British Columbia, factories in Ontario, and seal hunters in the far north. Maybe that last one didn't age so well. The newly recolored 50 featured the beloved Canadian Mounties, which would probably also be controversial today, given how a lot of people think about the police now. By the time the 69 bills started to be rolled out, Queen Elizabeth mania had cooled down a bit, and the Queen was kicked off 4 bills. Laurier was put on the 5 and Macdonald on the 10, and 2 other denominations now got former prime ministers as well. This was a very important development as far as Canadian culture goes, because it grew the canon of officially great Canadian prime ministers up to 4, which is basically the amount that has stayed in the Canadian imagination ever since. On the 50, we got William Lyon Mackenzie King, and on the 100, we got Robert Borden. I don't know how much internal debate there was over at the Bank of Canada over picking these two, but in retrospect, they seem like pretty obvious picks. After Macdonald and Laurier, they were Canada's two longest-serving former prime ministers at the time, and once again, one was a Liberal and one was a Conservative. They also happened to be the men in power during the First and Second World Wars, two wars which are heavily sentimentalized in Canadian culture, and growing up, I was always told that this is why they were picked. The decision to elevate all of the former prime ministers to the lower denominations was part of a conscious effort on the part of the Canadian government of the time to improve knowledge of Canadian history, and I would say it has been relatively successful. For the next 40 years, these were the 5 faces that stared at Canadians from their wallets, and I would say several generations of Canadians have accordingly grown up with at least some vague familiarity with these people as their country's greatest statesmen. Next, we got the bills that were released by the Bank of Canada between 1986 and 1991, so these were the ones that I grew up with. I think most millennial-aged Canadians will have fond memories of these bills because these were the ones that we got our allowance or paper route money or whatever in. The $1 bill was abolished at this time in favor of this thing, the infamous Canadian loonie. But other than that, the bills were more or less the same as the ones from the 60s and 70s, with the biggest aesthetic difference being the ditching of the nature scenes in favor of giving each bill a different Canadian bird on the back. In 2001, the 6th generation of Canadian bills dropped, and these are my favorites visually. They featured large, unique portraits and a cool, modern look. This time it was the $2 bill that was abolished in favor of the toonie, and no new 1,000 was released. The government was getting a little bit wary of $1,000 bills by this time, in part because Canada now had a national sales tax, and dodging taxes seemed like one of the only reasons why anyone would want to do a cash transaction of over $1,000. The 2000-era bills were also the most culturally ambitious, featuring detailed montages of broader Canadian cultural concepts than had been attempted to date. The 5 had a montage of Canadian winter sports. The 10 had one about peace. The 20 featured a collage of famous works by Canadian Indigenous artists. The 50 had a salute to the legal equality of women, and the 100 had a tribute to exploration. And that brings us to the final line, the money that Canadians use today, the final 5. No new $1,000 bills ever wound up being made, and their legal status formally ended in 2021. This current line of Canadian bills first started being rolled out in 2011, and for the first time, they were not made of paper, but rather polymer, which is a type of flexible plastic, you know, for security. In my opinion, these designs are a lot less inspired than the ones that came before, with pretty generic photo portraits and uninspired layouts. The cultural illustrations have become a lot simpler as well. So we got a train, an icebreaker, a famous memorial honoring Canadians who died in World War I, the so-called Canadarm on the International Space Station, and this generic humanoid female doing some science. I put it like that because access to information disclosures obtained by the CBC have since revealed that this woman was purposely drawn to look as ethnically neutral as possible, lest someone be offended. In 2016, the Canadian government announced that it would no longer be releasing series of new bills, which is to say that going forward, instead of coming up with a new bill template and then redoing the existing bills one at a time in the new style, they would just redo every bill from scratch, with every new design going forward existing in isolation from each other. And Canadians got a clear sense of just how radical this new approach would be when the new $10 bill was released in 2018. Pretty much everything had been changed. Not only was there a brand new aesthetic featuring a far more abstract and geometric design than had ever been seen before on Canadian currency, but the layout was vertical, and for the first time in 40 years, Prime Minister Macdonald was gone. Conservatives in Canada have sort of retconned this into Macdonald being cancelled, given that a few years later there would be an active effort to take McDonald's name and face off of everything as punishment for him being a racist man from the 19th century. But in reality, at the time, taking McDonald off the 10 was part of a grander long-term project from the Bank of Canada to just mix things up a bit and put some new characters from Canadian history in the spotlight for a change. Characters like Viola Desmond. So Viola Desmond was never particularly famous, something which I think is reflected by the fact that there only seems to be one photograph of her in existence. A black woman in 1946, she was arrested for attempting to sit in the white part of a segregated movie theater in Nova Scotia. Although this wasn't exactly a big news story at the time, in more recent years, her plight has been elevated as an iconic example of the sort of mean-spirited pettiness that Black Canadians often had to endure back then. Her promotion as the new face of the 10 thus represented an effort to make the lives of ordinary Canadians as much a part of our official national story as the big shots. In 2020, the government announced that the $5 bill would be redesigned next, and they did this whole gimmicky PR routine where they put out the names of a bunch of lesser-known people from Canadian history and were like, ooh, who will be the one to replace Sir Wilfrid? The answer was supposed to be revealed in early 2021, which I distinctly remember because I made a video talking about how the new bill would be coming out
at some time in the next couple of weeks.
Back on January 30th, 2021. But 2021 came and went, and it never happened at all, and soon the press was reporting that the whole project had fallen into ambiguous limbo. Not to be all Daily Wire about it, but in the aftermath of Scientist Gate, I imagine it is possible that the bank got a bit paralyzed trying to settle on a historical figure who wouldn't defend anybody. Or, you know, maybe it had something to do with security. In any case, in 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died, and Prime Minister Trudeau, who is a big royalist, made it known that he wanted the new king to take her place on the 20. And just last week, the Bank of Canada has announced that it is now officially in the process of redesigning that bill. Upon hearing this news, I immediately sprang to the Bank of Canada's Instagram page. Whatever happened to the redesign of the 5? That was supposed to happen in early 2021, if I recall correctly, to which the bank replied,
On May 6, 2023, the government in Canada announced that the next $20 banknote will feature a portrait of His Majesty King Charles III. We are implementing the government in Canada's plans, and we are proceeding with the redesign of the $20 note. As such, working on redesigning the $5 has been stopped.
The Instagram post added that we expect the new $20 note will be introduced in early 2027. So there you have it, no new Canadian money for at least 2.5 years, with the King Charles bill, when it comes out, being the first new Canadian bill in almost 9 years. But I mean, realistically, there's reason to suspect it could take even longer. Like, it is hardly beyond the realm of possibility that King Charles, who has cancer, will die sometime between now and 2027, and the Bank of Canada will have to start the whole process over again for King William. But on the other hand, who cares? Canada is often said to be one of the most cash-free countries in the world, with almost all shops and people preferring to do card transactions whenever possible, even at like the hot dog stand. It is a process that really accelerated during COVID, when many stores stopped accepting cash for sanitary reasons, and now there's no going back. I personally pay for nearly everything in my life with Apple Pay now, and this is probably the most cash that I've handled in years. So who knows? Paper money is a bit of an anachronism, but given its rich history, it is still an anachronism that I love to study. What Canadian symbol would you like to see me do a deep dive on next? Let me know in the comments. Do not forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next week.